The year was 1885, and the steam whistle of the Pennsylvania Railroad echoed through the industrial heart of Philadelphia like a battle cry of progress. Theodore Whitmore stood in his mahogany-paneled office on the third floor of the railroad headquarters, watching the black smoke rise from the locomotive yards below. At 42, he had built an empire of steel rails that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, connecting cities and towns with the precision of a master clockmaker. His reflection in the window showed a man hardened by years of ruthless business dealings. Grey streaks had begun to thread through his dark hair, and deep lines etched around his eyes from countless hours spent poring over route maps and financial ledgers. Theodore wore his success like armor, a perfectly tailored wool suit, gold pocket watch, and the confident bearing of a man who could buy and sell lesser men with a signature. The railroad business had consumed every waking moment of his life for the past 15 years. He had started with a single locomotive and a dream of connecting the scattered towns of Pennsylvania. Now, his company employed over 3,000 men and operated 200 miles of track. Freight cars bearing the Whitmore Railroad logo carried grain from the farmlands, coal from the mines, and manufactured goods from the bustling factories of the East. In the corner of his office sat a photograph that he rarely glanced at anymore, his wedding portrait from 1868. Margaret had been 21 then, with golden hair piled high in the fashion of the day and eyes that sparkled with hope for their future together. She had worn her grandmother's pearl necklace and a silk dress imported from Boston for the ceremony. Theodore remembered how proud he had felt walking into the Presbyterian church with such a beautiful bride on his arm. But that was 17 years ago, before the railroad had demanded every ounce of his attention. Margaret now spent her days managing their household on Rittenhouse Square, attending charity meetings with the wives of other prominent Philadelphia businessmen, and writing letters to her sister in Boston. They shared the same roof but lived separate lives, connected only by duty and social expectation. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Theodore called, turning from the window. His secretary, Mr. Patterson, entered with a stack of papers requiring his signature. "The quarterly reports from the Pittsburgh division, sir. Also, there's been another request from Mrs. Whitmore's charity committee. They need approval for expenditures related to the orphanage fundraiser." Theodore waved dismissively. "Handle it through the usual channels. Mrs. Whitmore knows the budget allowances." He had long ago delegated all household and social matters to others, viewing them as distractions from the serious business of building his railroad empire. As Patterson left, Theodore returned to his desk and spread out the engineering plans for a new rail line extension into western Pennsylvania. The project would require significant investment but promised substantial returns as coal mining expanded in the region. Numbers and logistics filled his mind, tonnage calculations, labor costs, and construction timelines. These were the things that mattered, the concrete elements he could control and manipulate to generate profit. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet Margaret had selected when they first moved to the Rittenhouse Square mansion. She had such hopes then for entertaining and building their social standing in Philadelphia society. Theodore had attended exactly 3 dinner parties before declaring them a waste of valuable time. Outside, the sounds of the railroad yard continued, the hiss of steam engines, the clang of coupling cars, and the shouts of workers loading freight. This was Theodore's symphony, the music of progress and prosperity that had driven him to work 16-hour days for over a decade. Margaret Whitmore sat in the morning room of their Rittenhouse Square mansion, her delicate fingers wrapped around a china teacup painted with tiny blue roses. The November morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across the mahogany table where she took her solitary breakfast each day. At 38, she retained much of the beauty that had captured Theodore's attention nearly 2 decades ago, though her golden hair now required careful arrangement to hide the grey, and her blue eyes held a weariness that spoke of years of disappointment. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, marking another morning in a life that had become as predictable as clockwork. Theodore had left the house at dawn, as he did every day except Sunday, when duty required his presence at church services. Their housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, moved quietly through the dining room, clearing away Theodore's untouched breakfast plate. He survived mainly on coffee and whatever meals could be brought to his office. Margaret opened the morning edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, scanning the social pages with practiced indifference. The Astors were hosting another grand ball in New York. The Vanderbilts had donated another substantial sum to the Metropolitan Museum. These were the circles she should have been moving in as the wife of a successful railroad magnate. But Theodore showed no interest in such pursuits. She turned to the women's section, where an article discussed the latest fashions arriving from Paris and the proper etiquette for afternoon calling hours. Margaret had memorized such rules years ago, though she rarely had occasion to use them. Her social circle had gradually shrunk as other wives grew tired of making excuses for Theodore's constant absence from dinner parties and cultural events. A knock at the front door interrupted her reading. Through the morning room doorway, she could see Mrs. O'Brien approaching the entrance hall. Margaret heard muffled voices and the sound of footsteps on the marble floor. She assumed it was another business associate seeking Theodore, though it seemed unusually early for such visits. Mrs. Whitmore, Mrs. O'Brien appeared in the doorway, holding a small bouquet of late autumn chrysanthemums tied with a simple yellow ribbon. "These flowers were delivered for you, ma'am." Margaret set down her teacup in surprise. Theodore had not sent her flowers since their engagement 17 years ago. She accepted the bouquet, inhaling the sweet, earthy scent of the golden blooms. A small card was tucked among the stems, written in unfamiliar handwriting. "For the lady who brightens the grey November days with her kindness to the workers' families. Your charitable work does not go unnoticed." The card was signed simply, J. Sullivan. Margaret's heart fluttered with an emotion she had not felt in years. Appreciation. She recognized the name from her volunteer work at the Railroad Workers' Relief Fund. James Sullivan was a foreman in Theodore's rail yards, a man she had met briefly during her visits to distribute food baskets to families affected by workplace injuries. He was perhaps 35, with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. Mrs. O'Brien lingered in the doorway, clearly curious about this unusual delivery. Margaret carefully placed the flowers in a crystal vase, arranging them with more attention than she had given any task in months. The bright chrysanthemums brought life to the formal morning room, their cheerful color a stark contrast to the subdued browns and greys that dominated the mansion's decor. "Shall I mention the flowers to Mr. Whitmore when he returns this evening?" Mrs. O'Brien asked. Margaret paused, considering the question. Theodore would likely dismiss the gesture as inappropriate familiarity from an employee if he noticed at all. More likely, he would grunt acknowledgement while reviewing his business papers and forget about it entirely. "That won't be necessary," Margaret replied softly. "Mr. Whitmore has more important matters to occupy his attention." As Mrs. O'Brien departed, Margaret returned to her chair, but found herself unable to concentrate on the newspaper. She kept glancing at the flowers, remembering James Sullivan's respectful manner during their brief encounters. He had tipped his cap politely and spoken with genuine concern about the injured workers' families. Unlike her husband's associates, who addressed her with the distant courtesy reserved for decorative wives, Sullivan had looked directly at her when speaking, as if her opinions actually mattered. The morning stretched ahead with its usual emptiness. Perhaps a visit to the seamstress, correspondence with her sister in Boston, and preparation for another solitary dinner while Theodore worked late at his office. But today, the bright chrysanthemums would remind her that someone had noticed her existence. Someone had taken the time to acknowledge her small efforts to help others. Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks, unaware that this simple gesture would soon set in motion events that would shatter the careful distance she and Theodore had maintained for so many years. 3 weeks passed, and the chrysanthemums in Margaret's morning room had begun to wilt, their golden petals falling onto the mahogany table like small promises of autumn's end. But their replacement arrived each Monday morning, sometimes late roses from a hothouse, sometimes simple daisies, always accompanied by a brief, respectful note from James Sullivan. The messages never crossed the boundaries of propriety, speaking only of gratitude for her charitable work or commenting on the weather, but their consistent arrival had become the bright spot in Margaret's otherwise monotonous routine. Theodore remained oblivious to these weekly deliveries, consumed as he was by negotiations for a major government contract to transport military supplies to western forts. The deal would secure his railroad's dominance in Pennsylvania and potentially expand operations into Ohio. He arrived home well after dark each evening, ate a cold dinner brought to his study, and fell asleep over financial projections and route maps. On this particular December morning, Snow had begun to fall outside the mansion's tall windows, dusting the bare branches of the elm trees lining Rittenhouse Square. Margaret sat reading a letter from her sister Catherine in Boston, who wrote of attending the symphony and hosting dinner parties with her husband's business associates. The contrast between Catherine's active social life and her own isolation felt particularly sharp in the grey winter light. Mrs. O'Brien entered with the morning's delivery. White roses this time, their petals still kissed with melted snow. The accompanying note read, "The first snow reminds me of your kindness to Mrs. Murphy when her husband was injured last month. Such grace deserves recognition." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She remembered visiting the Murphy family, bringing soup and ensuring their children had warm clothing for winter. It had been such a small gesture, yet James Sullivan had noticed and appreciated it. When had Theodore last acknowledged any of her efforts, charitable or otherwise? As she arranged the roses, Margaret heard the familiar sound of Theodore's heavy footsteps in the front hallway. This was unusual. He typically left before she finished breakfast and never returned before evening. She heard him speaking sharply to Mrs. O'Brien, his voice carrying the edge it held when business matters frustrated him. "Mrs. Whitmore," Theodore called, his tone brooking no delay. Margaret set down the roses and smoothed her burgundy wool dress before entering the hallway. Theodore stood near the marble-topped table where the morning mail was sorted, his overcoat still dusted with snow and his face dark with anger. In his gloved hand he held an envelope. "What is this?" He thrust the envelope toward her, and she recognized James Sullivan's careful handwriting. Margaret's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "It appears to be correspondence, Theodore. Don't play games with me, Margaret. This was delivered to my office this morning by mistake. A love letter to my wife from one of my employees." His voice rose with each word, echoing off the high ceiling of the entrance hall. "It's not a love letter," Margaret replied, though her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Sullivan has been sending flowers to thank me for my work with the railroad families. His notes are perfectly respectful." Theodore's grey eyes blazed with fury. "Flowers? How long has this been going on?" Margaret lifted her chin, feeling a spark of defiance she had not experienced in years. "Several weeks. I saw no harm in accepting gratitude for charitable work that benefits your employees. My employees have no business sending flowers to my wife." Theodore began pacing the narrow space between the hall table and the staircase. "This Sullivan character will be dismissed immediately, and you will cease this ridiculous charity work that has clearly given him inappropriate ideas about his station." The injustice of his reactions struck Margaret like a physical blow. For 17 years, she had lived like a ghost in her own home, managing his household, maintaining his social obligations, and asking for nothing in return. Now, when someone had shown her a small measure of appreciation, Theodore's first instinct was to destroy it. "James Sullivan has done nothing wrong," she said, her voice stronger now. "He's a good man trying to support his family while working in your dangerous rail yards. If anyone should be ashamed, it's the husband who ignores his wife so completely that she finds more recognition from a stranger than from her own spouse." Theodore stopped pacing and stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time in years. Margaret realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with the release of emotions long suppressed. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times in the sudden silence, marking a moment that would change everything between them. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Theodore said quietly, his voice more dangerous in its controlled fury than when he had been shouting. "You will go to your room and consider the proper way for a wife to behave. And if I discover any further contact between you and this Sullivan, there will be consequences you won't enjoy." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I will not be treated like a wayward child, Theodore. I am a grown woman who deserves basic courtesy and respect." With that declaration, she turned and walked up the curved staircase, leaving Theodore standing alone in the hallway with the evidence of her rebellion clutched in his hand. By noon that same day, James Sullivan found himself standing outside the gates of the Whitmore Railroad Yard with his few personal belongings wrapped in a canvas sack. 20 years of loyal service had ended with a curt dismissal delivered by Theodore's assistant, who had avoided eye contact while explaining that Mr. Sullivan's services were no longer required. No reason was given, but James understood perfectly well what had transpired. The December wind cut through his wool coat as he walked through the industrial district toward his modest row house on Carpenter Street. His wife Ellen would be expecting him home for lunch, and their 3 children would need to know that their father's steady income had vanished just 3 weeks before Christmas. The irony was not lost on him. His gesture of appreciation toward a lonely woman had cost him the job that supported his family. Meanwhile, Theodore had returned to his office with a fury that his employees had rarely witnessed. He dismissed meetings, ignored urgent telegrams from business associates, and spent the morning pacing behind his massive oak desk like a caged animal. The photograph of Margaret on their wedding day seemed to mock him from its corner position, reminding him of promises he had forgotten and a woman he had taken for granted. His pride had been wounded in ways he was only beginning to understand. For 17 years, he had assumed Margaret was content with their arrangement. She managed his household, he provided financial security, and they maintained the appearance of a respectable marriage. The revelation that she had been receiving attention from another man, however innocent, shattered his carefully constructed world. At 2 o'clock, Theodore made an unprecedented decision. He informed his secretary that he would be leaving early and walked the 8 blocks from his office to Rittenhouse Square. The snow had intensified, and his footsteps left deep impressions on the brick sidewalks as he wrestled with emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Margaret was in the library when she heard the front door close. She had spent the morning in her room as Theodore had demanded, but not in repentant reflection. Instead, she had written 3 letters, one to her sister Catherine, one to the charitable organization requesting a leave of absence, and one to James Sullivan expressing her regret that her gratitude had cost him his employment. She had sealed all 3, but had not yet given them to Mrs. O'Brien for posting. Margaret. Theodore's voice came from the library doorway, quieter now, but still carrying an undertone of controlled anger. She looked up from the book she had been pretending to read. Yes, Theodore? He entered the room and sat in the leather chair across from her, a chair he typically occupied only when reviewing business documents. The silence stretched between them, filled with 17 years of unspoken grievances and growing distance. I dismissed Sullivan this morning, he said finally. Margaret closed her book and set it aside. I assumed you would. A man's livelihood means nothing when your pride is threatened. Theodore's jaw tightened. My pride? A wife receiving gifts from another man reflects on both of us. What would people say if this became known in our social circles? What social circles, Theodore? Margaret's voice remained calm, but her words cut deeply. We attend church on Sundays and occasionally dine with your business associates. I haven't been to a proper social gathering in over 2 years because you find them tedious. The wives of your peers stopped including me in their activities long ago. The truth of her words hit Theodore like a physical blow. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he could not name 3 women who might be considered Margaret's friends, could not recall the last time she had mentioned attending a ladies' luncheon or charity meeting beyond her work with the railroad families. I work long hours to maintain our standard of living, he said, but the justification sounded hollow even to his own ears. You work long hours because you prefer your ledgers and rail schedules to human company, Margaret replied, including the company of your wife. Theodore rose from his chair and walked to the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered square. What would you have me do, Margaret? Abandon the business that supports this house, your clothing, your comfort? I would have you remember that I exist, she said quietly. I would have you notice when I speak to you at dinner instead of reading your papers. I would have you ask about my day, my thoughts, my feelings, just once in the past 5 years. He turned from the window to find tears glistening in her eyes, not tears of anger, but of profound sadness. The sight unsettled him more than her earlier defiance had. James Sullivan sent me flowers because he saw me as a person worthy of gratitude, Margaret continued. When did you last see me as anything more than another household expense to manage? Theodore had no answer. The question hung in the air between them as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, marking another hour in a marriage that had slowly died from neglect and indifference. The week that followed brought Philadelphia its heaviest December snowfall in a decade. The city's industrial heart slowed as locomotives struggled through drifts that reached the windows of passenger cars, and the usual cacophony of the rail yards was muffled by blankets of white. For Theodore Whitmore, the enforced quiet provided an unwelcome opportunity for reflection. He had not spoken to Margaret since their confrontation in the library, though he was acutely aware of her presence in ways he had not been for years. He noticed that she took her meals in the morning room rather than joining him in the dining room. He observed that the flowers in the front hallway had been removed, leaving the marble table bare except for the morning mail. Most unsettling of all, he realized that the house felt different without the sound of her voice. Even the brief exchanges they had maintained about household matters were absent. On Thursday evening, as Theodore sat in his study reviewing contracts by lamplight, Mrs. O'Brien knocked on the door. She entered carrying a silver tray with his dinner and an expression of unusual concern. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, I hope you don't mind my speaking, but I'm worried about Mrs. Whitmore. She's barely eaten this week, and she seems different. Sadder, if you don't mind my saying." Theodore looked up from his papers, irritated by the interruption, but unsettled by the housekeeper's words. "Mrs. Whitmore is fine, Mrs. O'Brien. She's simply adjusting to some necessary changes in routine." The older woman hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but constrained by her position. "Yes, sir. It's just that she's been such a kind mistress all these years, and seeing her so quiet." She trailed off, curtsied slightly, and left him alone with his meal and his thoughts. That night, Theodore found himself unable to concentrate on the financial projections that typically occupied his evenings. Instead, he walked through the house, noting details he had not observed in years. Margaret's needlework was displayed throughout the rooms, delicate embroidery on pillows, carefully mended linens, and a half-finished tapestry depicting a garden scene. When had she created these things? How many quiet hours had she spent beautifying their home while he focused exclusively on building his railroad empire? On Friday morning, Theodore made another unprecedented decision. Instead of going directly to his office, he walked to Carpenter Street in the working-class district where his employees lived. The row houses were narrow and modest, but most were well-maintained despite the economic struggles their inhabitants faced. He found James Sullivan shoveling snow from his front steps, his breath visible in the frigid air. Sullivan looked up in surprise as Theodore approached, his expression wary but not hostile. "Mr. Whitmore! Sullivan!" Theodore removed his hat, suddenly feeling awkward in the unfamiliar role of supplicant. "I've come to offer you your job back." The younger man leaned on his shovel, studying Theodore's face carefully. "With respect, sir, what's changed?" Theodore had rehearsed several explanations during his walk, but standing in the snowy street facing a man whose livelihood he had destroyed over jealousy, they all seemed inadequate. "I acted hastily. Your dismissal was unjustified. Was it about the flowers I sent your wife?" The direct question caught Theodore off guard. He had expected denial or evasion, not this straightforward acknowledgement. "Yes," Sullivan nodded slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore is a good woman, sir. She brings food to families when the breadwinners are injured, sits with sick children, listens when people need to talk. In 20 years of working the rails, I've never seen an employer's wife take such genuine interest in the workers' welfare." Each word was like a small knife twisting in Theodore's chest. "I know. The flowers were nothing more than gratitude. I hope you understand that." "I do now." Theodore replaced his hat and prepared to leave, but Sullivan's voice stopped him. "Mr. Whitmore, your wife deserves better than flowers from a grateful worker. She deserves them from her husband." That afternoon, Theodore did something he had not done in 15 years. He left his office at 3 o'clock and visited the finest florist in Philadelphia. He purchased 24 white roses, the same type Sullivan had sent, along with a card on which he wrote simply, "For my wife, who has waited patiently for me to remember what matters most." When he arrived home, Margaret was in the morning room, reading by the window in the fading winter light. She looked up as he entered, surprise and wariness flickering across her features. Without speaking, Theodore placed the roses on the table beside her chair and sat down across from her, something he realized he had not done in their own home for months. "Margaret," he began, his voice rough with emotions he was only learning to acknowledge. "I've been a fool." She set down her book but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I've spent so many years building the railroad that I forgot to build our marriage. I dismissed Sullivan this week out of jealousy, but the real problem isn't that another man appreciated you. It's that your own husband failed to." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she still remained silent. "I want to try again," Theodore said. "I want to be the husband you deserved when we married. The man who sends you flowers and asks about your day and notices when you're sad. I don't know if it's possible after so many years of neglect, but I want to try." Finally, Margaret spoke. It will take more than flowers and pretty words, Theodore. It will require you to change priorities you've held for 17 years. No! He reached across the small table and took her hand, the first time he had touched her with affection rather than mere courtesy, in longer than he cared to remember. But losing you would be worse than losing the entire railroad empire. I understand that now. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Philadelphia in pristine white that promised the possibility of fresh starts and new beginnings. Inside the warm morning room, a husband and wife began the difficult but necessary work of rebuilding a marriage that had nearly died from neglect. One conversation and one gesture of genuine attention at a time. The railroad would continue to run, but Theodore Whitmore had finally learned that some things were more valuable than steel rails and quarterly profits, and that the most important journey was not measured in miles of track, but in the distance between two hearts finding their way back to each other.